Yeah, just Dave.
Right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our forecast contest discussion. Today is April 28th, and this is actually going to be our last HDD forecast, our last 16 to 20 HDD forecast. So starting next week, we're going to switch over to CDDs. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But also today, we have a special guest, Dave D'Arcangelo, who's going to join us here in just a little bit. Is going to talk to us about his view. Dave has many, many years in the weather commodities market, and he's going to spend some time talking about his views on how the recent corona pandemic is going to or is impacting the job market, employment market for weather and commodities, and just sort of have a little bit of an open discussion about that. So I think that could be really helpful. So we're going to save that from about the last 30 minutes of today's discussion. So it's going to be a bit abbreviated. Okay, so with that, why don't we kind of get into it? We'll start with attribution. We'll get into the forecast. We'll see how far we get, and we'll go from there. But before we jump head in, is there any other items that folks want to cover today?
Nope.
Yeah. And again, regarding the CDD change, Zach and I, even if we don't cover it in today's call, we'll make sure to cover that in the emails that go out between now and next week. All right, so let's look back. So this is the most recent verification on my screen. This forecast was made April 7th and verified the 22nd to the 26th. So I will sort it by CRPS, that's our performance metric. And we were just talking about this offline. At the top is Matt Rogers from Commodities Weather Group. It looks like here Matt was the top performer for a combination of having a good centerline forecast, 50 HDDs, and the verification was 53. So pretty close and certainly better than normal, which was at 48.7. But it also was because of his spread, right? Very low spread, you know. And hey, if the way CRPS worked, right, it's a function of your mean and your spread, right? That's why we do it. It's a probabilistic measure. And Matt obviously had high confidence in this forecast, and he was rewarded for that high confidence. So that's why he did so well, even though a few folks down here actually had a centerline forecast that was a little bit closer than Matt's. But Professor Lupo, I don't think he's on the line, but he also did quite well. Dave D'Arcangelo, who's going to be joining us, did well. And even some of the model inputs, which have struggled at times this year, in particular the CFS did quite well. And then near the bottom, this is kind of a surprise, but you know, Paul Roundy, who's done quite well this winter, looks like went for some of the warmer changes there, which didn't quite materialize at this point. And I guess also just, you know, zooming back out, again, the verification was 53 HDDs, so that is above the 30-year normal. It's certainly above the 10-year normal. So this was, I think, at least was this the third period in a row that was cold? At least the second. Let's look back real quick. But I think the pattern shift happened around the 10th. So this is the forecast that verified 8th through the 12th. This forecast, yeah, verified pretty close to normal, 65 versus 66 or so. And then we have the period that verified the 15th to the 19th. And this forecast, of course, was very cold, 83 HDDs, and normal was, you know, in the 50s. And then we have our current, most recent verification, which also verified. So, you know, the forecast kind of shifted above normal HDD somewhere around the 10th or so, and then, you know, we really haven't looked back since. So it's been kind of cool forecast. I'll just take a look at this in terms of the pattern here real quick. So we'll go to our Dynacast tool. I think I've got it here somewhere. There it is. Just so folks can see what the pattern looked like, what was driving it, etc. And then, of course, we can open this up to everyone here. Let's do Northern Hemisphere. There we go. That's the temperature, and I'll switch over to the 500 millibars so we can proxy the jet stream. All right, there's kind of the jet stream configuration, or at least 500 millibar configuration, um, with the elongated trough providing some of the cooler weather across the eastern states. The little bit of a P&A ridge there, a little bit of an NAO ridge there, um, and ultimately, enough to get some of the colder weather down across the lower 48 here. Let's also take a look. I'm going kind of fast, but stop me if you guys like. Let's also take a look at what we were forecasting back start of this period. Was it April 7th? Is that right?
Yeah, it was April 7th.
April 7th. Okay. Whoops. Oop, screwed that up. So we'll pull up the Maxar report and see what Maxar and the models were showing there. Maxar, I think, what do we say? Maxar did, I think they did pretty well in this forecast too, right? Yeah, Maxar performed better than climatology, and they were only about 3 HDDs off, and we already talked about the fact that the EC and CFS also did fairly well this period. All right, so let's go back to the report. Here's the report for the same period. And you can see, yeah, certainly the CFS had kind of that cool forecast across the eastern states. EC didn't look quite as cool, but I guess it worked out. Let's take one more look at the pattern, how the pattern verified. So I'm going to go back here. I just want to look at it from states, because sometimes, we talked about how you can get it right from an HDD perspective, but you didn't really get it right from a pattern perspective. I'm just wondering in particular about the West. Yeah, so in terms of the West, there was certainly some, warmth in the West. It was a kind of a classic sort of, almost like a positive P&A, warm in the West, cool in the East. So let's flip back here and just, this is, the EC just kind of, if anything, from a pattern perspective, I think if Steve Bennett were on the line, I don't think he is, but he'd kind of say, yeah, got it right from an HDD perspective, but from a pattern perspective, if you were making point forecasts, let's say supply chain, you were making forecasts all across the country, I'm not sure the EC would have done that well, right? If you had to make forecasts for Denver and Salt Lake City and Chicago and New York, you would have favored the cold in the West a little bit, and kind of a normal to even slightly above normal look in the Southeast. So EC was right, but the pattern arguably wasn't so hot. CFS looks a little bit better, right? Definitely had the cold skew in the East and a little bit of a warmth in the West. And Maxar, we don't want to beat up on our friends at Maxar, but also it looks like leaned a little bit more to the cool in the West look, central to West, a little bit more of the warmth to the East. And again, as we looked at, it actually verified more ridge trough kind of pattern. So this is a great example of why obviously the absolute number is important, and it's certainly important to some of the users, in particular like natural gas traders who really focus on the numbers. But for folks who rely more on point information, who need information about stations all through the country, arguably the EC and CFS forecast, in particular the EC forecast, may have not have been so hot, so good. Let me just stop there for a second and just kind of open it up. And I guess we really didn't talk about the attribution too much, but I'll throw up those questions to folks in terms of, we saw, I guess a couple attribution questions. Looks like I'm on the wrong thing here. Attribution questions. One, any other thoughts in terms of that pattern configuration, the ridge trough pattern, and in terms of how well you think the models actually resolved it versus just kind of the numbers worked out? And I guess bigger picture, one of the things I've thought about is, we've definitely, I'm going to pull up the one other chart before we just make a quick comment. When we look at these are like the 500 millibar height patterns over the last 7 days. So this is the last 7 days, and clearly we talked about since about April 10th or so. So even a little bit earlier than this, we've kind of had that cool pattern in the eastern states, right? But we also know this is the 30-day running time series, and this is the 90-day running time series, right? And when we look, across most of this winter, we actually had this ridge in the East Pack. The trough was favored out west, and the ridge in the southeast. Very similar to the Maxar forecast, right? Probably not a coincidence, right? Maxar was favoring a pattern which has been there most of the winter. But again, rotating back, what do we see? A little bit of a dip, right? That ridge in the East Pack shifted a little bit east, and the trough was able to also shift a little bit east, and we had cold in the east. So my question is, like, what happened, right? Like, is this just? I mean, all winter long we struggled to get any kind of persistent cold weather in the eastern states, and it took until what, mid and late April, where now we've had a 2.5 week period, 2.5, let's call it 2 weeks, whatever, 2 weeks plus period of pretty darn cold weather. I'm guessing if this had happened in January, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I'm guessing in January this would have been, a really bona fide cold period in January, right? Maybe temperatures near zero, not far from New York City, et cetera. But it didn't happen. It happened now. Does anyone have any thoughts? Is this in terms of why we couldn't get something like this then, and we have it now? Is it dumb luck? Is it just, it's the randomness of the science or of the atmosphere? Let me stop there and open it up.
I'll venture a guess. I've mentioned this. I think a couple other people have as well. I think it goes back to that huge low um, that was over in that area. I guess it'd be around a month ago now, ish, give or take. Um, that set the NAO on the path to head to negative, and that acted as the catalyst for change because you can see that blocking coming in the past month or so, and I think that's, at least from my perspective, that's had a big influence on our overall pattern because the storms haven't been able to just um, bowling ball up the coast, as I've heard it put so quaintly before.
I like that term.
or
Yeah. So when you say that, Michael, it's almost like you're suggesting that it took a synoptic level event to finally trigger a change, maybe in the North Atlantic, and there was that bowling ball effect or whatever. But for whatever reason, maybe it was just the points didn't come line up quite right earlier in the winter, and they lined up a little bit better about a month ago. That set off that chain reaction. When I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want back to you in here in a second, but it almost sounds like in part some of that is unexplainable back in November and December. In other words, we put out all these seasonal forecasts, or we do, a lot of the vendor groups, a lot of groups who speak to us on a weekly basis. They're putting out seasonal forecasts, winter forecasts in October or November, and it just makes, your comment makes me think, how much of that is really predictable if some of these things that happen are really triggered, that some of these longer term changes are triggered by shorter term, smaller scale type events.
yeah, I mean, I'm never really I've never really been a big fan of excuse me, winter forecasts. Um, as a matter of fact, my winter forecast is usually whatever the opposite of what Joe Bastardi says is going to happen during the winter.
Oh,
um, but you know, I would say winter is just super hard to predict overall, even a few days out, let alone several months. So I don't know how much predictability there is other than maybe a broken clock being right twice a day. But that's not to say you can't forecast something that far out. I mean, I look. I know it's not the same, but the hurricane season. Usually the forecasts for that are pretty close to accurate. Not in terms of like hurricane pathing 3 months in advance, but um, like take this hurricane season for instance, where everyone's expecting a higher than average number of hurricanes, and I'm sure that'll be fairly close to whatever numbers they're coming out with, as they often are. So I'd say overall my point is I think the winter is just hard to predict, even in short range, like 2, 3, even 1 day sometimes, and that a winter forecast isn't. I personally don't think a winter forecast is particularly useful.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Any other thoughts?
Well, I also wanted to bring up, since it's been a big theme of this winter, was right around the time that this period verified was the first time that the AO kind of went into neutral, if not negative phase. And it wasn't there for very long. It looked like if you go to the teleconnections page on the CPC, it wasn't there for very long, but it might have been enough to let some sort of opposite pattern to what we've been seeing kind of sneak in, and then now it appears that back up to a more highly positive AO signal.
Yeah. And speaking of AO and NAO, the other thing, I cheated a little bit before here, and I was where was I? I was looking at the MJO because I was thinking about this question a little bit. Like I said, I cheated. Um, and the other thing I noticed, so this is the RMM phase diagram, right? And this goes back. It doesn't go back to all winter, but goes back to late January. January is in was it red? No. Which January? I guess it's just a couple dots, but February is in red, March is in green, and then April is in blue. And we talked about how this pattern shift, uh, at least in terms of seeing temperatures realizing colder. I'm just sorry, with the Zoom thing, I have to manually add folks, I guess, for the security thing. So I was just adding Philip there. Um, but sorry, what I was saying is I noticed that from a temperature standpoint, right, we really started to see that shift into the eastern United States when we saw this amplification around phase 8. And I wonder how much of that is also part of this. We didn't see, at least since late January, really good MJO into phase 8. And you guys might recall that I think through most of the winter, phase 8, it tends to be one of the, if not the coldest signal for the eastern states. You can see it if you guys look at some of the phase plots and stuff like that. I won't go to it now. And so this actually, I think this also links to what Michael said too a little bit, that I wonder if it's just, some of this coincidence, some of it, that you just had enough forcing, right? Because the MGO phase 8 is also linked to negative NAO, which is the point that Michael made. So maybe these things two are related, that you saw enough synoptic subseasonal pressure to finally trigger something, right? Trigger something loose so that we end up here with a two-week plus. Who knows how long it's going to last? Because if you believe some of the forecast models, we've got another 2 weeks ahead of us. But at least a 2+ week period of cold weather that we really couldn't get in the winter, but now we finally got in April. So again, just to summarize that, is it too that unless you can predict some of the synoptic / subseasonal oscillations, it's very hard to resolve fully what those winter months are going to look like. Any other thoughts on attribution before we do an abbreviated sort of forecast discussion? Okay, let's shift over and just look at today's forecast. Blow up my screen a little bit. Again, we'll do an abbreviated version. I think Dave actually jumped on, so we're going to switch over to Dave's talk here in about 10 minutes. So I'll give a quick summary. Again, I think Michael also pointed this out just before we got started. We're getting obviously to the end of HDD season, and so these numbers, the means and the spreads are coming down, right? And in fact, again, this is going to be our last HDD forecast. We're going to switch to CDDs next season or next week. But you can see our range here today. It looks like 27 on the high end, the 20-year moving average, and the CFS. Interestingly, the CFS on the low end at 19.5. This was the 0Z run of the CFS, which was kind of a warm run here. And then again, you can see how the spreads are pretty low too. So who wants to kick us off and give us their 2-minute spiel here?
I can volunteer as tribute. Okay, so so my forecast was for 25.9 HDDs with a slightly lower spread, so above average confidence spread of 6 HDDs. No changes to the formula. The main theme I had this week from the teleconnections was that there wasn't really like a clear cut like change in the signal strength that I saw from anything. So NAO seemed to be kind of doing the same thing, slightly positive, slightly negative, hovering around neutral. AO, same thing basically, a little dip towards negative a couple of times, but not too sure how accurate that's going to be since the verification has been kind of bumping up and down towards the one extreme to the next. And PNA staying, it looks like it's going to bump, wants to head towards positive, but again, it's been verifying more towards negative, at least in the past a little bit. So we'll see if that holds true to continue. EPO again a little on the neutral side, but again I didn't see anything to really indicate that there'd be a big change in the pattern that we've been having these I guess past 2 weeks now, as we've mentioned. So the CPC agreed with that as well, with below normal for the Northeast and the extreme upper Midwest, which is really the only HDD producers at this time anyway. So that's how I got to 26-ish, or 25.9, I should say. And the spread I lowered just because it just seems, at this point, there's very little to indicate that we'll be near any of the extremes. So I just lowered my spread to account for that higher confidence that everything seems to be essentially continuing the same as it's been these past 2 weeks, if there is a pattern to be had out of these last 2 weeks, I should say, as a caveat. Any questions?
I guess with my client hat on, I guess the question, I just want curious, the last 30 days, yeah, most of us had not surprisingly, a negative bias, underestimating, right? Underestimating the HDDs. Looks like Mike, you've had a little bit of that too. I guess that was my question, right? I'm putting on my jerky client hat on. I look at your numbers, Mike, and it looks like to me you're suggesting that this, we're in this cold pattern, right? Like if I look at these numbers, Mike, which you have quote unquote access to, right? I could see the strip over the next 15 days. Generally, there's a little bit of a break here the next few days, but generally it kind of looks cold into the 11 to 15. And it looks like over the last few weeks, we've underestimated a little bit the cold weather. How come your number is not colder, I guess?
Generally, because at this point, the spread is so low that I'd need to see a very strong signal one way or the other to deviate much more than a few HDDs from the 30-year normal, and I didn't see any kind of strong signal anywhere to indicate that there'd be a reason to deviate from that. That doesn't mean I can't be wrong and something changes, but it's 16 days out, and something can always change.
Let me just stop you there. I think that's a really good answer. Like I think that was like a really, and you can leave out the part about being wrong. Everyone knows that, right? So you don't have to. That's just fluff, right? You don't have to tell anyone that. You don't have to tell the traders or your end users, right? But that part leading up to it, saying that, hey, listen, I don't see any clear, consistent signals. I see that there are some things that are driving the cold here in the next 10, 15 days. but I don't see a strong NAO block. I don't see a strong PNA ridge. I don't see a strong MJO signal. If I did, I might go stronger. But based on the data that I see, including the numerical model guidance, which isn't extremely cold, and maybe even I default to my normal weighting scheme, which gets me to this number. So yes, I see why. I see that it's been cold. I see that my bias has been, I've underestimated the cold over the last couple of weeks, but that I cannot apply that to the 4-week forecast. There's nothing that tells me that just because I missed it 2 weeks ago, that I'm going to miss it again 2 weeks from now. I think there's equal chance. I'm not saying you think this exactly, but it's almost implied that equal chance that things could reverse, right? And I could miss the 2-week forecast. It could flip a lot warmer, and I could underestimate the warmth. So I just thought that answer you gave was a very fair answer to give, and I that part in particular. So nice work there.
Thanks.
Okay, we still have a couple more minutes. Anyone else want to give their thoughts? And let's do this super quick. Like pretend you're the 1 minute drill, not even the 2 minute drill, the 1 minute drill, and your end user only has just a couple minutes and they got to go.
I guess in classic tradition, I will go next.
Great.
All right, so using my strategy, which is basically Mike's strategy, but added with the tropical signal and a tiny weighting of the EC, that puts me at a slightly above average numbers. And I used below confidence because it wasn't very clear to me, because there wasn't a very strong signal from the tropical guidance. So I also lowered my weighting for that just for this week. And as I mentioned, mixed signals, I really wanted to put in a +1 HDD fudge factor given my previous bias, but I didn't see any good reason to, so I ended up not putting one.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. All right, Zach, you want to?
Yeah. Basically, I kept the same formula since the last day of last forecast of the heating season. Just kept the same formula. That's worked for me pretty well. Although I did struggle over the last 2 weeks, so I was contemplating making some sort of change. But after looking at from a pattern perspective, I didn't really see much to apply. So my number came in just slightly warmer than the 30-year. I see the only risk in this forecast, I'd say, is in the Northeast. There's a lot of cold leading up in the 5 to 10, 10 to 15 in the Northeast, and then the CFS has to disappear entirely. It seems to have some pretty strong warmth in the EC. There's not anything super strong to see in the EC, but I still the only risk in this forecast would be in the Northeast. And anytime I see the CFS really warm and the EC cold, I would mark that as a forecast of interest. But again, I didn't really see much to deviate from my formula that much, and I feel that any sort of risk would be captured in a normal spread.
I think that's an interesting point, about the EC and CFS, talking about some of the differences there, and if that has an impact on confidence. I know there's definitely some, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of thought that, that is an important indicator of confidence. And I think, but I think that's another area of, important area of study to see exactly how much that does provide context in terms of confidence. Because the devil's advocate view is that the models are highly correlated. And so in some cases, even when they're different or the same or what have you, that you don't get a ton of new information, in particular about the pattern. But I think that's an interesting point. Okay. Let's see, anyone else on the line who would like to go before we close this out and switch over to our talk?
I guess I can kind of give a little brief one.
Yeah, go ahead. I got Sean, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So I'm still working out kind of a formula. This is only my second prediction, and I'm trying not to just go with like an instinct number. Although what I would instinctively say is my number would be higher than 25.7. So I attributed 50% to the ECM WF. It seemed that all the telecommunications were hovering around 0. They were giving mixed signals, positive and negative, but it didn't seem too erratic. Maxar also weighted that pretty heavy. And then the CPC had pretty much a broad band across the whole country, mostly the West Coast and East Coast too at normal for the 30-year. So I weighed that pretty heavy. And then just to kind of bring it back down a little, I threw some MJO in there because that was giving a lower HDD. So I wanted to bring it down just a little bit. And then I threw the 30-year moving average because everything that I was looking at seemed to go with kind of average temperatures.
Sean, I think that's you brought up something, an interesting point too about the MJO analog. You know, I think that's an interesting point. I think it'll be interesting a couple of weeks to come back and look at this forecast because, you know, I think you can make a case that the MJO was an important part of getting us to this cold pattern, right? I'm saying a lot in a little bit of time, but you know, we know we went through a strong phase 8 phase, which historically is associated with cold, and we know it's coming out of that. To some degree, it's coming out of that. And certainly our little analog tool here is showing that it is going into a warmer direction. So I think it's an interesting point that you observe that and are weighting that as part of your forecast process. I think that, I think it's an interesting data point.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I was just going to say, you know, I think Sean referenced Radiant or Maxar, and one comment from them caught my attention when I was reading the report earlier. The ECM model is given favorability due to its higher skill when compared to the CFS model. I was thinking about how much has it really done that much better this winter? It's definitely done better, right? But let's see, what do we have here? The EC, it's definitely done. Okay, I think that's a fair statement. Looking at some of this stuff, not that the EC's done maybe necessarily great, but the CFS at -65, the EC -23, so it's certainly done better. I was just thinking to myself, it's done better, but I'm not sure, it's done well. But maybe that's a discussion for another time. Okay, so looking at the clock, why don't we switch now? Again, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is awesome. Dave D'Arcangelo, who has many, many years of industry experience, has volunteered to provide his thoughts on how the corona is potentially going to could impact the job market, employment market. And I know that's of interest to a lot of folks on the line right now and a lot of other folks who participate. So with that, I just want to hand it over to Dave. Dave, would you like the screen, or how would you like to go about that?
Just talking is
okay.
Just talking is fine. No, I don't need the screen. So hey, thanks, Dave. I appreciate the chance to chat with everyone and share some thoughts. These last maybe probably 7 or 8 weeks now have seen for all of us, whether you're young or older like Dave Margolin and myself, probably the greatest amount of upheaval in our lifetime. So that kind of goes without saying. And along with that, for me, an awful lot of introspection about kind of a what now, right? Everyone's asking the questions of, and these are good questions about like, what's the path forward look like for people who are in school and how that's going to look in the next even just 6 months. People are asking it in the workplace. For those of us who are fortunate enough to have jobs where we can work from home, still a valid question. Obviously, the unemployment picture is, to put it lightly, grim. And that's particularly hard in the service sector community, but even other industries are going to be impacted. And really the point is, I think it's being impacted in ways that we can't imagine. So I started pondering this 4 or 5 weeks ago, and it was partly due to the upheaval, and then also copious amount of free time. While my company transitioned to the work from home situation, there was a few weeks that things were rather slow. And so it's a chance to kind of sketch out in my mind, I think it's a fairly common feeling to have things feel unsettled right now. We've all experienced this earthquake and really the ground is kind of still shaking, but being part of this discussion has been great. I've really enjoyed it. I think there's some very smart, deep thought, some very good science going on, and I'm happy to be part of it. So I put myself in a lot of people's shoes, saying, like, if I was sitting there performing weekly forecasts and kind of going through the motions of that and having these discussions, and the backdrop was that the world had kind of completely fractured underneath my feet, what would I be thinking, and how would I be maybe contemplating changing my view or charting a course or trying to just plan for what my very early future looks like, in my 20s, not far out of school. I want to say at the outset, these views are personal. These are David D'Arcangelo's views. They do not in any way represent those of my employer. So I want to say that at the outset. To that effect, though, what I'm probably going to say has less to do with an industry, because I just don't feel like any of us have any clue as to how industry itself is going to change. But one thing that seems fairly clear is that some fairly interesting and amazing changes will occur that we just can't foresee. That happens with every upheaval of this sort. So it's difficult to sit here and say, well, I think you should focus on X industry or go in X direction, or say something positive or negative about a particular facet of atmospheric science, like research or academia. Not only would my forecast there be particularly worse than a week 3 forecast, but it doesn't really serve a purpose, because I think there's some other things that are worth keeping in mind. Some of these are, I think, have been valid for a long time in the business world, in industry and academia. And I wanted to highlight a few that really came to mind for me the last few weeks, I think, that are of vital importance going forward. So rather than just say, oh, I think that, there'll be fewer opportunities in energy trading, but more opportunities in, I don't know, predicting weather in the retail and insurance space. That's speculation, and it's not really worth going into, because I don't have a feel for that. But let me highlight a few things that stuck out as I kind of thought about my career path and what was important to me and what I really think is pretty vital going forward. And some of this is changed a lot because of how social media has changed, the ability to do calls like this one, the ability to share information and ideas. The first thing I want to say, I think it's vital. I think it's vital when you're young, in college, just coming out of school, starting your career. I think it's really vital to have a mentor. Finding a mentor is probably, in my view, never been easier. For one, there's LinkedIn, there's Twitter, there's plenty of other formats where people advertise themselves, put themselves out there. I will say this, people are typically very stingy with money, but they give their time away for free. And if you've noticed about anything in weather Twitter space, people are willing to give an awful lot of information away for free. And furthermore, they're actually quite flattered when you ask them about themselves. Sometimes you have to knock on a few doors before you get a good response, but it turns out that people are, once they put information out there, that we always like a lot of validation. And so someone writing back to me from, a university is actually quite flattering. It's probably worth pursuing a conversation, and sometimes that in turn can turn into a mentorship. Mentorships often come from initially some people in our academic sphere, professors who we've had a great relationship with. We've enjoyed their their teaching style or their course material. We've got something of value from it. We think we can apply it in our early years of our career. So I think mentorships can be found there. The AMS has started a mentorship program a few years back. I've been fortunate to participate in that with some young professionals, and that's been worthwhile, but that's a more formal avenue. But my idea behind a mentor is to really develop a network of people that you know. It's personal, it's friendly, it's shared, it's tend to be conversational. You've all studied hard, I think, and you've all pursued your career or you pursued your degree. But I'm thinking about now, when I think of mentorship, I think about education that is really more caught than taught. A textbook can teach you the principles of meteorology, but a mentor shows you how to think like a meteorologist. You can study something about, say, coding, but to actually work in that environment, you're going to actually learn the principles of doing that well for a certain industry, or academic research, or any number of jobs. And so I'm just pointing out a few. But I think mentorship is more vital than ever. The world will change in ways through your 20s that you probably can't envision. I know for both Dave Margolin and I, the way the world transitioned from, say, the late 1990s, which was really like, elementary school internet. There was no social media. The understanding of how to utilize that information was bare bones. The colossal change that took place between about 1998, 99, and just 2003 or 4, and that's without a pandemic, that's without like upheaval across society. That change was phenomenal. We didn't really foresee the ability to utilize online information and data streams like we could. And that was just at the early stages of it, right? Every 4 or 5 years, we can go forward now from that point to 2020, we've seen huge changes. So I think that one thing it's tough to predict is what will the world look like through your 20s, and you just don't know. I think mentorship helps guide you through that a little bit and provide you a network of people that you can call on. So that's my first one. My second one is the idea about taking risks. The avenues to pursue in atmospheric science probably have never been greater. I don't know what's going to become a focus in the next 10 years, but even with the pandemic, I don't see those avenues decreasing in number. The opportunities in information and science and statistics and the ability to put meaning to those things probably grows. Just in the last few years, we've seen a huge push in subseasonal forecasting, and you're bearing witness to what you're trying to do with, trying to have high performance and come up with metrics and evaluating yourself. That is not just applied across the energy industry. We know that's being applied across a lot of industries now, and industries are finally taking advantage of it in fairly substantial ways. So my point is that we can't predict what's going to change, but I think this opportunity to take risks and have one of them pan out has probably never been higher. When I was graduating in your shoes, and it's been over 25 years now, there were only a few paths to take. There was a private sector path, which was quite confined to a few small companies. There was the National Weather Service. There was the military, and I took that path. But otherwise, the paths were fairly small. And there was an academic path, which kind of led you down the teaching and research direction. But the paths have increased markedly. So I think that the opportunity to take risk and not be afraid to take risk is important. And that leads me to my third point that I wanted to share with you today, which is I think sometimes when you're trying to discern which way we go forward, we have this preoccupation in career advice to say, look at your strengths and figure out how to exploit them. So really it's one of the implications of that is we select a career path or a job where talent trumps interest. We ask ourselves, what am I good at? And that's a valid question, but I think a harder question to ask is, what am I motivated to do? Now, your parents probably want you to ask the first question of what am I good at? Because what am I good at leads to a job, job leads to some money. I can pay off my student loans and live independently. think that's fine for a short-term goal, but the better question I would probably ask myself is, what am I motivated to do? And not just now, but what am I motivated to do to get better for the next, say, 10 years, right? What am I willing to work at? And where am I willing to go? What kind of jobs am I willing to take to advance that? So motivation, I think, is often overlooked, right? We take sometimes a path of least resistance because what am I good at? What am I talented at today leads to the immediate job, right? You'd come in for an interview with me. We'd say, yes, you're talented at job X. We hire you to do job X. Nothing wrong with that. That could be fulfilling. You can enjoy that. It's nice to get a paycheck. But I think the people that have done well, the people that I look at who are my mentors, the ones who've taken risks, they tend to ask the question, what am I motivated to do day in and day out to get better at, to become the best in my industry, say over the next 10 years? So it's not a time horizon of 6 months to a year. And I know that's a valid time horizon, particularly for parents who want to see their kids graduate and get a job. But what am I motivated to do? What risk am I willing to take? And what mentors can help me do that, I think are never been more important today, particularly in light of a world with a pandemic than before. So again, not a lot of advice on industry, particular sectors, but I think it's more of just David Arcangelo's life lessons, rules of thumb, so to speak, for my approach and how I'd look at the world. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm happy to take any questions offline. I think Dave has my email and phone number. I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to chat with anyone more about that or about anything specifically that I think I see in the industry. We can get into maybe the weeds. I didn't want to get into the weeds today because I didn't feel like that would be as helpful.
Hey, Dave. This is Zach. I appreciate you sharing all this advice with us. I really appreciate it. When you're talking about taking risks, are you talking about like when you're looking for your first job and trying to find something and get settled, or are you talking a couple years down the line when you're kind of had a little bit of experience in your belt? When are you talking about taking risks?
Zach, I think both, but I think taking risks from the outset, having a risk mindset, I think having a risk mindset is important throughout your career, and you'll evaluate risk as your life situation changes. But I look back when I was, in my early to mid 20s, as having that opportunity, and I didn't take that risk then. I actually took more of my risks in my career in my 30s. But the point I'm trying to make is, and I've worked with young people, one thing I've tried to encourage them is take that risk early on. And I think that risk can take a lot of different forms. And I'm not talking about the risk like I want to tell my parents I'm going to go sell everything, not pay my student loans, and go live on a mountain in Tibet and ponder the world, right? Not that kind of risk, but I think it's a risk of there's job opportunities now that exist all over the world. Our world, the world is obviously, it's never been quote unquote bigger in the sense that you can find opportunities that are in other countries, spread across different industries. Listen, if you told me I have a job opportunity and I can take it in, I'll just give you an example. I can take it in, close to home in New Jersey, or I can go work my first year of my career in Singapore. I'm probably going to tell you to go to Singapore. You're going to meet different people. You're going to experience a different culture. You're going to be exposed to different ideas. You're going to meet scientists. Scientists think differently in different parts of the world. You're going to be exposed to different academics. It's just that idea behind, when you're young, you can take that risk. I'm 48. I can't just, pick up and move to Singapore tomorrow. It's a lot more difficult, right? It might seem daunting when you're young, but at the same time, what's the worst that could happen, right? Like, you go there for a year, you don't like it, you move back home and you look at something else, right? But you've had the experience, right? Look at the opportunity of building a resume early on from a practical standpoint, but also from just a personal growth standpoint. I think risk is important from the outset. And I'm talking about calculated risk. I'm not telling you to go be foolish. You don't ever go back and say, there's this guy that spoke to us you know, on April 28th, and he told us to just go, quote unquote, find ourselves. I'm not saying that at all, right? Like, don't misquote me. But I'm really emphasizing that, you know, given a few opportunities of relatively equal value, I think you should take the one that challenges you more and pushes you a bit out of a comfort zone. Just from the standpoint of experiencing how industries work across cultures. And I think that's super important today. Does that help you answer your question, Zach? Did I
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, if there are no other comments, this is Lynn Travachino. Dave, I don't think we know each other, but I've worked with Dave Margolin for about 5 or 6 years now. So I'm also mid-career level. I'm an educator at Rutgers. I worked in the private sector. I've pretty much been everywhere. And I would just, first of all, I think this is great, what you're doing today to offer this kind of general advice. I try to do that in my classes a lot, and I don't think the students get to hear it very much. So I think this is a really good thing that you're doing. And I just wanted to second sort of what you said about taking risks. Reflecting back on my own career, I didn't take, or it didn't appear that I was taking risks, but it looks like, you know, I guess I was. I had jumped around from different, from industry to industry, sort of. I had been an engineer in remote sensing, and then I just kind of left all that and went and worked on Wall Street for 5 years. And then I left all that and went back to academia. And those are switches and moves that I certainly would not be able to do now later on in life, but I was able to do earlier in my career. So I would second what you're saying, to definitely take those risks early on. And I'd also like to second what you're saying in terms of encouraging students to do what they're motivated to do and not necessarily what might be in their skill set now. I think that's also extremely important. I see students because, you know, just because it's not necessarily what they have experience in now. And I would always say to my students, you know, you can do anything that you want to do, and I will encourage you to do it, and just ask for help, and I will find a way to help you do it. So I like that message as well. I just wanted to say that.
Thanks, Lynn. I appreciate those comments, and it's nice to meet you. It's also, I love hearing about people's career paths, and you taking a zigzag path of engineering, Wall Street, academia is certainly, it's probably not the way you scripted it, I'm imagining.
No, there was definitely no script. Still isn't.
Hey Dave, and any other thoughts or suggestions for folks in terms of speaking of skill sets, I guess, you know, a lot of our folks here in school or just getting out of school. Any recommendations in terms of what kinds of skill sets they should focus on, or if there's a diverse group of kind of things that they should? So, you know, like you mentioned at the beginning, hey, you got some extra time. Well, you know, I'm guessing some of our students here and recent grads also have a little bit of extra time. How do you think they can best utilize some of that extra time?
Ooh, that's a good question, Dave. And it's a challenging one. I don't want to box myself in here by some of my own biases. But let me try to answer it this way. There's two ways I'll look at it. One is the practical way. One is that you know, it never hurts. It never hurts to make yourself better at something in your field of expertise. That could be it could be coding. It could be your ability to your presentation style. It could be your it could be a specific skill set related to you know, a type of research that you want to pursue, or an academic field you want to go in. And I think that's where a mentor can help an awful lot. So I think having some time to do that is always valuable, because partly that's personal growth, whether that leads to a direct job or not. The second part is a bit more vague, and let me answer it this way: is in the immediate future, it feels like we're going into a world and I might regret saying this, but it feels like we're going into a world where you're going to have to, and I'm talking specifically in the private industry, that I think you're going to have to be able to show you can create profit. Let's say you are, and this is interesting for meteorologists because we're typically in the role of information providers. And then we kind of sit back and say, well, I've given my user group information that they can go do something with. I think there'll be a significant leap in the space to say I have to be able to add value monetarily. And so that's taking my weather forecast another step, taking a model I've built of supply and demand one more step, taking my skill set another step to quote unquote monetize it. And that, we're running out of time here. I don't want, that's a longer discussion. But in a world where employment is changing a lot, I think there'll be more of a push in that direction. That's hard to think about, though, I think, when you're just out of school or beginning your career, right? How do I do that? That's something that I think those are hard questions for you and I to answer, Dave.
Yeah.
And maybe even Lynn would be able to chime in and say her experience saying, like, how do you add that next level? That's hard. But at the very beginning, let me go back and finish by saying, I don't think it's wrong to just increase your ability to do something well, communicate, code, learn a statistical package, learn a specific tool that can help you. It's all a resume builder. So I don't have a direct answer for like what one thing might be the most important at this point.
Hey, Dave, I know we're almost out of time, but I at least one more question. Can you've had a lot of success in this industry. You really have. It's meteorologists in this industry, and over the last couple decades. What do you think, looking back beyond your natural talents, what are the one or two or whatever things that, looking back, you feel like, yeah, I did this right. I'm thankful I did it this way. Because this really helped put me on that path that's allowed me to have some of this success.
Well, thanks for the flattery. Appreciate that. One thing that comes to mind for me is I've never been, I've always tried to be humble with my approach to what I do, with the realization that I could be wrong a lot, but with the promise that when I'm wrong, I will try to figure out why and to apply that going forward. I also think a certain amount of humility of saying I don't know, and that's a particularly poignant challenge. I think when you make in this class of making a week 3 forecast, right? The I don't know is a big one, but the follow-on to that is, I don't know, I will try and figure it out, or I don't know, but here's the layers of uncertainty that surround this. The people I feel like I didn't want to become like were the ones that had the largest egos. And part of that's a personality trait of mine. But always trying to stay humble, always trying to reference things that I don't know, but I'll try to figure out. But also be honest about my ability and what I think the limits or the limits of good science are. That's carried me, knock on wood, pretty well so far. But I think this is a tough business. Someone early on said, if you're going to make a career in forecasting and do it well, you have to have a little bit of a closer's mentality, to use a baseball analogy. That's tougher now since we're not playing any sports. And the closer forgets what happened yesterday. Does learn from it, but forgets the result and the outcome. Learns from it and applies it going forward, but you kind of have to just come out swinging every day. That's the challenge I enjoy in the forecasting realm, in trying to monetize those forecasts. But I think being a really good closer, you have to have a little bit of an ego, but I feel like it has to be dosed with a fairly high degree of humbleness and humility at how challenging this is. So that's served me well. Listen, I know plenty of people, you do as well, Dave, that have big egos and have had good careers, and they have large outsized personalities. And maybe they can roll with the punches a little bit easier. But I feel like when I'm a bit more humble, I can cushion the blows somewhat. Thanks.
No, I love that analogy. I'm sure Zach, who's a big Yankees fan, is ready to cue up Enter Sandman. But no, this is really great. I think we probably have to leave it there. Just looking at the time, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But Dave, thank you so much for providing your thoughts. And as Dave mentioned, he's volunteered, to talk to folks. So if you want Dave's email address, if you don't have it or whatever, just email me. And I'll be happy to provide his contact information. But yeah, I think this was really good. I think we'll have to do something like this again in the future, and I hopefully everyone got a lot out of this, and we'll be sure to share it with the rest of our forecast contest discussion community here, because I think there's a lot there. Right.
Thank you. You're welcome. You're very welcome. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
All right, and thanks everyone for staying a little longer. And we'll see everyone, I hope, next week. Take care, guys.
See ya.
Hey guys, enjoy the rest of your week.
You too.